I never believed in ghosts. If you'd told me 6 months ago that I'd be sitting here, too afraid to even glance at my own reflection, I would have laughed in your face. But things change when you've lived through the kind of hell I have. It started in the house on Hawthorne Lane, a tired, sagging Victorian in the middle of nowhere. I moved there after the breakup, after losing everything I thought I'd build my life around. Amanda and I were together for 5 years. When she left, I couldn't stand the sight of the apartment we'd shared. Every corner reminded me of her. So, when I saw the rental ad for the house, cheap, secluded, the kind of place where no one would bother me, it felt like the universe was throwing me a bone. I packed up my life in a couple of garbage bags, loaded up my beat-up Toyota, and left the city without looking back. Hawthorne Lane was everything I wanted. Quiet, forgotten, the kind of place where I could lick my wounds in peace, or so I thought. The house had a strange charm, though calling it charm might be generous. The paint was peeling, the porch sagged, and the floorboards groaned with every step. But the rent was dirt cheap, and it felt empty. I needed empty. The first few weeks passed uneventfully. I worked my remote job during the day and spent the evenings fixing up the place. I even started sleeping better. The nightmares that had plagued me since the breakup faded, replaced by dreamless, heavy sleep. But then the whispers started. At first they were so faint I thought I was imagining them, a soft murmur when the wind blew, like the walls were carrying on conversations of their own. I told myself it was nothing. A draft, maybe, or the pipes settling. The house was over 100 years old. Of course, it made noise. But then I heard my name. It was late. I'd been lying in bed, scrolling mindlessly through my phone when it came. Just one word, barely a whisper.
Ethan.
I froze. My chest tightened, my ears straining against the silence that followed. The rational part of my brain screamed that it was nothing, but something deeper, primal, told me otherwise. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I chalked it up to exhaustion. I'd been pushing myself too hard with work and the house repairs. That had to be it. But deep down, I knew better. The whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, more insistent. Sometimes they sounded like my own voice, soft and mocking. Other times, they were guttural, inhuman. They followed me from room to room, always just out of reach. I tried everything to drown them out, music, podcasts, even blasting the TV at full volume, but they always found their way through. And then came the shadows. It started in the corner of my eye, flickers of movement that vanished the moment I turned my head. At first I told myself it was a trick of the light, but they became harder to ignore. One night, I saw a figure standing at the end of the hallway. It was dark, so dark it seemed to swallow the light around it. I couldn't make out any features, just a shape, a human shape. I blinked, and it was gone. The next morning I found muddy footprints leading from the hallway to the front door. By this point, I was barely holding it together. Sleep was a distant memory, replaced by a constant gnawing dread. I called the landlord, desperate for answers, but he was evasive. "It's just an old house," he said. "They make noises. Don't worry about it." But I could tell he was lying. Determined to find out the truth, I went to the local library. The house had a history, all right. The kind you'd expect from a place like that. Accidents, disappearances, a husband who went mad and killed his wife in the early 1900s. There were rumors too, stories about seances and occult rituals performed by the original owners. "Some houses don't want to be lived in," the librarian said, her voice heavy with warning. That night the house turned on me. It started with the whispers. They were louder than ever, a cacophony of voices screaming over one another. Then the walls began to shudder. The lights flickered, plunging the house into an oppressive darkness. I ran to the bathroom, slamming the door shut behind me. The whispers were everywhere now, inside me, tearing at my sanity. And then I saw it. The mirror above the sink was fogged, though I hadn't used the shower. I wiped it clean with trembling fingers and stared at my reflection. At first it was just me, my pale face, hollow eyes. Then it moved. Not a flicker, not a trick of the light. It grinned. After that, things spiraled out of control. I started waking up in strange places. The basement, the attic, even outside in the backyard. The knife from the kitchen kept appearing in my hand, though I had no memory of picking it up, and the whispers. They weren't just whispers anymore. They spoke to me. They told me to do things. Horrible things. The breaking point came a week later. I woke up standing over my bed, the knife in my hand. My reflection stared back at me from the window across the room, but it wasn't mimicking my movements. It tilted its head, its grin stretching impossibly wide. "You're not strong enough to stop me," it said in my voice. Something inside me snapped. I lunged at the window, smashing it with the knife. Glass shattered, cutting into my arms and face. But I didn't care. I screamed, hacking at the shards until the whispers stopped. When I came to, I was lying in the middle of the living room floor. The knife was gone. The glass was gone. The house was silent. For the first time in months, I felt alone. I left the next morning. Didn't pack. Didn't tell anyone. I drove until I ran out of gas and found the nearest motel. Sometimes, I still hear the whispers. Late at night, when the world is quiet, they creep back into my mind. But I've learned to ignore them. What I can't ignore are the reflections. Because sometimes, when I catch my face in a passing window, it smiles back.
When I was a kid, my grandfather used to warn me about bad places, not haunted houses or cursed forests. Those were stories for campfires and cheap horror novels. He meant something different. He told me about places in the world that felt wrong, like a seam in reality had torn, letting something else bleed through. The bad places don't always look strange, he'd say, but you'll feel them, in your bones. I used to laugh at him, chalk it up to the ramblings of an old man who lived alone for too long. Now I think he was trying to warn me. It all started 6 months ago, when I was hired to catalog the belongings of an abandoned estate in Maine. The Thornhill Manor was perched on a rocky cliff overlooking the ocean, a grand house that had long since fallen into disrepair. The owners, distant relatives of the deceased, wanted the place cleared out for sale, but they couldn't be bothered to do it themselves. I didn't mind the isolation. After the chaos of grad school, I wanted peace and quiet, a chance to focus on something simple. The first day I arrived, I stood in the driveway staring at the house. It was a towering structure of weathered stone and dark wood, the kind of place that looked like it had been pulled straight from the pages of a Gothic novel. The windows were crusted with grime, and ivy crept up the walls like fingers. It should have been beautiful, but there was something about it that made my stomach twist. I ignored the feeling. The inside of the house was just as grim. The air smelled of damp wood and mildew, and the floorboards groaned under my weight. Most of the furniture was still there, covered in white sheets that were yellowed with age. The first few days were uneventful. I cataloged old books, furniture, paintings, nothing remarkable. If anything, I was disappointed by how ordinary it all felt, until I found the basement. The door was hidden behind a massive oak cabinet in the kitchen. I only found it by accident while trying to move the cabinet aside to get a better look at the wall behind it. The door itself was unremarkable, plain wood with a tarnished brass handle, but the air around it felt colder, heavier. I opened it anyway. The stairs leading down were steep and narrow, the kind you had to descend sideways if you didn't want to lose your footing. The smell hit me as soon as I stepped inside. Damp earth mixed with something metallic, like rusted iron. The room at the bottom was empty, just rough stone walls and a dirt floor. But in the center of the room, there was a trap door. It was unlike anything else in the house. The wood was dark, almost black, with iron edges that gleamed faintly in the beam of my flashlight. Something about it seemed alive. I should have left it alone. The next day, I returned to the basement with a crowbar. The trapdoor didn't budge at first, but after a few tries, it popped open with a groan that echoed off the stone walls. Underneath was another staircase. This one was different. The steps were made of black iron, polished to a dull sheen that reflected the beam of my flashlight. The walls weren't stone, but something smoother, almost glass-like, etched with swirling patterns that shifted as I moved. The air was colder here, biting against my skin, and there was a sound, a low hum, barely audible, like the vibration of a tuning fork pressed against my chest. I descended slowly, one step at a time. My breath fogged in the freezing air, and my footsteps echoed louder than they should have. The further I went, the more the walls seemed to change. The swirling patterns became sharper, twisting into shapes that looked almost human, faces contorted in pain, mouths open in silent screams. I don't know how far down I went before the hum stopped. That's when I heard it. It started as a faint tapping sound, like fingernails against metal. I froze, shining my flashlight down the staircase, but the steps disappeared into the black. The tapping grew louder, faster, as if something was climbing up toward me. And then it spoke. "Come closer." The voice was soft, almost a whisper, but it echoed in my mind like a shout. I ran. Back in the basement, I slammed the trapdoor shut and dragged a heavy cabinet over it for good measure. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely lock the basement door. But the tapping didn't stop. It followed me upstairs, faint but persistent, like it was pacing just beneath the floor. That night, I locked myself in one of the upstairs bedrooms and tried to convince myself it was just my imagination. But when I finally drifted off, I dreamed of the staircase. In the dream, I was descending again, but this time, I wasn't alone. Shadows pressed against me from all sides, whispering words I couldn't understand. The walls were closer now, their writhing patterns brushing against my arms like cold fingers. At the bottom of the stairs, there was a door. It was massive, carved from the same black stone as the staircase, with symbols etched into its surface that glowed faintly in the dark. The air around it was suffocating, thick with the stench of decay. Something moved behind the door, a shadow darker than the surrounding blackness. "Let us in," it said. I woke up screaming, my hands covered in dirt. The days that followed were a blur. I tried to avoid the basement, but the tapping grew louder, more insistent. The whispering followed me everywhere, through the halls, into town, even into my dreams. One night, I woke up standing in the kitchen, my hand resting on the basement door handle. I didn't remember getting out of bed. The next morning, I packed my things and tried to leave, but no matter which road I took, I always ended up back at the house. When the door appeared in the living room, I knew I couldn't run anymore. It was the same one from my dreams. Black stone, glowing symbols, and an aura that made my skin crawl. The whispers were deafening now, crashing over me in waves. I couldn't understand the words, but I felt their meaning deep in my bones. They weren't asking anymore. They were demanding. My legs moved on their own, carrying me toward the door. My hands trembled as I reached for it, and the moment my fingers touched the surface, the symbols flared to life. The last thing I remember is the sound of the door creaking open. When I woke up, the house was silent. The trapdoor was gone. The staircase was gone, but I wasn't alone. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to ripple, stretching toward me when I wasn't looking. And when I caught my reflection in the window, it didn't move. It just smiled.